The forest was quiet, but not empty. The kind of quiet that holds birdsong far away, tucked into upper branches, and carries the sound of wind only when it chooses. The trees stood tall and spaced just far enough apart to let light dapple through in slow-moving patches, warm gold that shifted as the breeze nudged the leaves. Sunlight didn't fall in beams here. It moved in spots, scattered, soft. The path wound gently forward, half swallowed by moss and thyme. At one point it must have been laid with care. Large stones fitted edge to edge, lined by low borders. Some still held their shape. Others had sunken or tilted under the weight of seasons. Grass grew through the cracks now. Ferns brushed the edges. But you could still feel the shape of it beneath your steps. Still know it had once mattered. Here and there signs of effort remained. A wooden post, long splintered, leaning toward the trees with no sign of what it once marked. A rusted chain coiled near the base of a stone, tangled in ivy that had forgotten it wasn't meant to grow there. Someone had tried, once, to keep this path clear. Someone had swept, trimmed, replaced stones when they loosened. That someone hadn't returned in a long time. Near the bend in the trail, a pile of carved stone blocks rested just off the path, half buried in moss, softened by time. Not rubble exactly, not scattered. They had been set down, then never lifted again. A few were still marked by chisels, letters unfinished, shapes no longer meant for use. Lichen traced their tops like lazy handwriting. A single glove lay near one of the stones. Leather, cracked at the fingertips, folded slightly inward. It wasn't torn, just tired. Dust had gathered in its palm, and one small beetle moved slowly across its surface, undisturbed. The trees overhead swayed in long, slow movements, not wind exactly, just agreement. The leaves turned their undersides to the light now and then, flashing white, green for a moment, then fading back into their darker shade. A branch creaked once in the distance, sharp but not loud, then stillness again. On the left side of the path, a broken bench rested where the undergrowth had nearly reached its legs. Stone base, wooden seat. The slats of the bench had begun to bow, the wood silvered and smooth from rain. One slat was missing. The rest still held, but not confidently. A vine had grown up through the middle of the backrest, flowering once, then gone to seed. Near the bench, a satchel lay half open, its strap buried beneath soil and leaf mold. Inside, a scrap of parchment curled into itself, a glass bottle empty but intact, and a small wooden spoon. All of it settled into place, like it had been set down quickly, then forgotten. Or maybe remembered too late. The trail sloped upward slightly, the incline made steeper by roots that had grown bold in the absence of maintenance. One root curled like a hand across the path, wide enough to trip over if you didn't step carefully. Moss blanketed it entirely, soft, thick, inviting, but not forgiving. The air here smelled of damp earth, bark, and thyme. No rot, just deep green, the kind of scent that doesn't rise, but stays low to the ground, where the stones remember footsteps. Far ahead, through a break in the trees, something pale flickered, not light, but color. Stone, wall, structure, whatever it was, had been touched by sun just long enough to catch the eye, then faded back into shadow. It didn't call, but it was waiting. The path continued toward it, winding slightly left, rising a little more. The forest stayed behind without resistance, and the overgrown stones, uneven and green-veined, held the shape of every step that had ever mattered here. Even if they no longer knew the names of those who made them. The wall didn't rise. It lingered, once tall, once sharp-edged and sure. The outer barrier of the castle had softened with time. The forest hadn't broken it down. It had simply waited, and the wall had leaned, fallen, split, surrendered. What remained now was low in some places, high in others. A suggestion of defense, a breadth of perimeter, but not a line you had to cross, just one you noticed when you stepped over it. The stones were thick with moss and lichen, layered in shades of green, grey, and rust. Some bore the marks of chisels, initials or symbols no longer legible. Others had cracked wide down the middle, their insides darker than their outsides, as though holding shadow in reserve. Ivy crept across the top, looping in and out of old mortar lines, content to stay. An archway had once framed the entrance. Now only one upright remained. The keystone had fallen decades ago, maybe longer, and lay in two pieces beside the trail, both half sunk into the earth. The crack between them had filled with leaves. A sapling had taken root there, thin, tall, new. To the right of the path, a rusted hinge still clung to a post, all that remained of a gate. The wood had vanished long ago, but the iron was stubborn. Its curve pointed skyward, twisted slightly at the top. Something had once swung from it, something heavy, perhaps, the kind of door that would echo when it closed. It hadn't echoed in years. Near the broken arch, a cartwheel leaned against the stone, its spokes warped, its rim cracked through in 3 places. The metal band had rusted entirely, orange and flaking. A vine had woven itself through the center and out again. The wheel didn't lean as if placed. It leaned as if it had fallen, then been politely left alone. Along the base of the wall, small things had gathered. A chipped ceramic bowl, filled with rain once, and now only with dust. The corner of a wooden crate, the rest buried or broken. A strip of cloth, too dirty to guess the colour, snagged on a bit of exposed iron. All of it quiet, all of it exactly where it had been left. The wall curved slightly to the left, tracing what had once been the edge of a courtyard. Through the gaps in the broken stone, you could see the beginning of the inner space. Pale weeds growing between flagstones, a patch of sunlight catching on something metallic. The gentle slope of stone stairs leading to nowhere in particular. A breeze moved through then, shifting the ivy slightly. It didn't whistle. It didn't speak. It just passed, brushing against stone and skin and silence without asking for attention. One bird sat on the edge of the wall, a blackbird maybe. Its feathers fluffed against the wind. It didn't sing. It looked once toward the open space beyond, then took off with two strong beats of its wings, curving up and over the gap where the gate had been. There was no threshold now, just the memory of one you stepped through without permission, without resistance, and the crumbled wall behind didn't try to stop you. The courtyard opened slowly, not with grandeur, but with space. There were no walls close around it now, only the broken outlines where they had stood, foundations still intact in places, stones collapsed in others. Grass had grown into the cracks between flagstones, pale green and soft, pushing upward through every seam. In some places it had won, in others the stone still held. At the center stood a fountain, dry, shallow, carved from pale stone, now darkened with streaks of weather and time. The basin had cracked in two places, one along the bottom and another up the side like a vein. A small tree had taken root in the basin, its branches reaching no higher than a person's shoulders, its leaves trembling in the light breeze. The tree wasn't strong, but it was certain it had made its decision. The spout at the center of the fountain was shaped like a lion's head, its mouth open in an expression meant for flowing water. Now it only held a small drift of leaves, damp and curling, pressed into the curve of its jaw. A bird had nested once atop the lion's head. The remnants were still there, twigs arranged in a circle, laced with old bits of cloth, and the corner of what might have once been a map. Scattered around the courtyard were remnants, not trash, not relics, just things that had stayed. a wooden bucket, collapsed inward, its handle broken and resting beside it. A bent spoon, a stone ball turned upside down near the edge of the path, its rim chipped, the hollow underneath filled with fine dirt. Nothing shiny, nothing sacred, just what had once been useful. To the left of the fountain stood the remains of a raised planting bed, stone border, soil long dried, but a few vines still creeping through. One bore tiny white flowers. Another had thorned itself into the side of the wall, clutching upward, as if trying to remember where it had been meant to go. Closer to the far end, a length of fabric lay half buried under leaves. It had once been a banner, deep red maybe, now faded to rust and gold and dull brown. The edge nearest the stone had burnt slightly. The rest had torn and fluttered in 100 different winds before settling here. One brass ring still clung to a corner. A bench, split down the middle, sat near the edge of the space, facing what had once been an entryway. The wood had twisted under the sun and snow. The backrest leaned away from its frame, one leg sunken deep into the soil beneath. A clay cup rested on the bench's seat, touched by rain through some accidental sheltering angle. The trees beyond the courtyard swayed in rhythm, but no branches leaned close. The space had once been cleared deliberately, and even now the forest respected its boundary. Sunlight came through in full patches here, warming the stone, catching on dust motes, and lighting the tops of broken posts like tiny lanterns. A few scrolls lay scattered near the edge of the eastern wall, paper mostly intact, browned with age. One had curled into a soft cylinder, edges frayed, ink smeared to illegibility. Another had flattened under a stone, its markings still faintly visible. Lines, maybe? A map? A sketch? A note no one remembered writing. They had not been dropped. They had been set down, then left. Above it all, the wind moved with gentleness, as if trying not to disturb the silence. It rustled the leaves in the young tree. It stirred the edge of the banner. It carried the scent of stone and grass, and nothing urgent. The courtyard held no ceremony now, but it held shape, held echo, held air. And when you crossed it, no footsteps followed. Other space still noticed. The tower stood like a memory that had forgotten its beginning. Only half of it remained, a crescent of wall reaching up 3, maybe 4 stories, depending on how you measured broken stone. The other half had fallen long ago, leaving the interior open to the sky and weather. You could see every level from where you stood, each marked by a ring of worn supports and what was left of the floor. The spiral staircase still clung to the wall. Its lower steps were intact, stone worn smooth in the middle, moss blooming along the edges. Higher up, several stairs had cracked, collapsed, or shifted just slightly out of place. They could still be climbed, but only slowly, only with care. No one had done so in a long while. The path was clear of debris, but heavy with hesitation. Birds nested in the broken windows above. Gulls, maybe, or jackdaws. They came and went through the open archways, calling once or twice before settling into silence. The wind made more sound than they did, rising in the shaft, pushing through gaps in the stone like breath through a reed. It didn't whistle, it murmured. The first landing still held remnants of use. A wooden crate, long splintered and half crushed beneath a fallen beam. A rusted lantern, glass still intact, but clouded with age. The hook it had once hung from still jutted from the wall, twisted slightly downward, as if tired. A few books had fallen from the higher level, their pages scattered and damp, spines curled from rain and sun. One lay open near the edge of the landing, its ink smudged into abstract shapes. A leaf had pressed itself into the center crease and dried there, veins intact, shape perfect. Up another turn, the second level opened to the air. A section of the outer wall had crumbled entirely, leaving a jagged view of the courtyard and forest below. From here, the overgrown path looked more like a vein running through green. The fountain was barely a shape, the bench a suggestion. An iron ring remained bolted to the wall, used once for hanging armor maybe, or a banner. Now it held nothing. But the wall around it was darker, marked by smoke or soot, or maybe just time. A sword hilt lay nearby, blade long gone. The leather grip had rotted away in places, but a fragment still clung to the core. It had not been dropped. It had been placed there, leaned carefully into the corner, as though its work had ended without fanfare. A stone basin sat near the final curve in the stairs, shallow, filled with rainwater. A few leaves floated in it. One feather. A coin rested at the bottom, dull silver, green at the edges. The water moved slightly as the wind shifted, catching light, distorting the reflection of sky overhead. At the top, the staircase stopped, without ceremony. The floor here had collapsed in most places. Only a rim remained, enough to walk if you hugged the edge, if you trusted the stone. The air was colder, more open. The view stretched out across the forest and beyond. Hills in the distance, mist pooling in valleys, a line of water far to the south. No roof remained, and only the highest point of the remaining wall bore the remnants of carving, a crest or a sigil, worn to near invisibility, but still there, a mark that had once mattered, that might still. The wind was strongest here. It tugged at your sleeves, pressed into your collar, moved through you with no resistance. But it didn't feel invasive. It felt familiar. And below, the rest of the castle waited, not as ruins, but as what had simply stayed. The doorway stood open, though the door itself remained. Thick slab of wood swollen in its frame, cracked at the bottom, leaning slightly on rusted hinges. Moss had begun to grow up the left edge, where water tracked down from the stone above. The handle was iron, cold even in sunlight, shaped like a ring that no longer turned anything. The door hadn't been used recently, but it hadn't closed itself either. Crossing the threshold changed the sound of the world. Outside, the wind had moved through leaves and over stone. Inside, it pressed against walls, then vanished. There was no bird song here, no breeze, only the faintest creak somewhere in the beams above. A sound like settling or remembering. The floor was stone, uneven in places, dusted with dirt and time. A thin trail showed where feet had once passed, often worn smoother than the rest, though that path didn't go far, just to the far wall where an arch opened into the next chamber. The rest of the floor was covered in fragments, small rocks, scraps of wood, a patch of dried mud cracked like old parchment. Along one wall stood what remained of a rack for torches. The brackets were still there, 4 of them, iron, slightly bent, nailed into stone with bolts that had rusted until they bled orange. One bracket held the remains of a torch, blackened wood, the cloth long gone. The wall above it was stained dark from smoke, the mark of hundreds of small fires over hundreds of dark nights. A banner still hung above the arch, or what had once been a banner. The fabric was faded almost to beige, though hints of red remained in the fold. The bottom edge had frayed into strips, and one corner had burned through, leaving a black-rimmed hole. It didn't move now. There was no breeze, but it hung still, defiantly, gently curved, as though it remembered wind. Below it, carved into the arch, a crest remained, barely visible in the dimness. Some kind of animal, maybe, a bird or a lion. The stone had eroded into suggestion. One wing, a claw, a swirl that might have been flame or water. It wasn't clear what it had once meant, but the space around it had been carved with care. that much remained. Against the far wall, a wooden bench rested. The wood had warped with moisture, the legs uneven. A cushion lay atop it, flat, lumpy, once vibrant blue, now dusted grey. One corner had torn, revealing a stuffing of straw and soft, dry moss. Near the bench, a bundle of scrolls lay tucked into a niche, or what had once been scrolls, now just tubes of curled paper, edges browned and edges curling tighter with each passing season. One had unravelled halfway and now rested like a loose ribbon across the floor. The ink had faded, smudged, worn thin. It hadn't been picked up in a long, long time. A single candle stub sat in a small niche by the door. The wax had melted into a shallow dish, pooled around the base, hardened with time. The wick had curled inward, burned once, but never again. Ash rested in the corner near it, just enough to notice. The ceiling arched above, ribbed with beams. One had cracked, deep in the middle, and been supported by a makeshift brace. Newer wood, younger, less worn. It had done its job. The crack had not spread. Dust hung in the air, undisturbed, not heavy, just present. Light filtered in through high slits in the stone, too narrow to be windows, too deliberate to be gaps. The beams fell in vertical strips across the floor, touching nothing important, just existing. The entry hall didn't offer welcome. It didn't resist. I simply held the kind of space where voice would echo, but wouldn't feel comfortable doing so, where presence felt noticed but not watched. And beyond the arch, the rest of the castle waited, stone to stone, room to room, stillness to stillness. The hall beyond the entry opened wide, not in length, but in height. The ceiling soared above, lost in shadows even when light poured in from the high arched windows. Some of those windows still held their glass. Others had broken long ago, leaving jagged edges softened by wind and dust. The intact ones were stained with colour, dulled by time, but still visible. Blues like lake water, reds like rust, yellows the shade of old pages. One window showed a starburst pattern, a sun perhaps, or something more abstract. The glass was cracked through the centre, a spiderweb fracture that held itself together anyway. Another showed a tree, roots curling beneath the frame, the branches arching upward into corners now darkened with moss. Light passed through both, casting faint colour across the stone floor in shifting patches. You had to look closely to see them. They didn't announce themselves. The walls were lined with banners. At least, they had been. Most had fallen. Of the 6 that once hung here, 3 remained, all torn, faded, and stiff with dust. One, deep green, bore a crest that had nearly vanished, a circle, maybe, or a serpent devouring its own tail. Another, once black, had turned grey at the edges. The symbol at its centre, a tower perhaps, or a single flame, was barely distinguishable now. The last hung the lowest, its bottom edge trailing slightly on the floor, soaked once by water and dried into a twisted shape. It might have been red, it might have been gold. The cloth didn't remember. The air here carried the faint scent of iron and dry stone. Not musty, not stale, just dog. The kind of old that doesn't press against you. It simply stays. The echo in the hall was soft but present. Even a breath seemed to linger a second too long. The acoustics were designed to amplify speech, to carry a voice from one end to the other, to let someone be heard without raising their tone. That design still worked, but no one tested it anymore. Along the left wall, a long table rested against the stone. Oak, or something that used to be oak. Its surface was warped, the grains split in places, and a bowl sat at one end, filled with curled scraps of paper. They had once been messages, perhaps, notes passed hand to hand, warnings, instructions, or poems. Nothing legible remained, just shapes and fibers. A sit lay tipped onto its side near the far end of the table. One leg cracked at the joint. A second chair, untouched, faced the center of the hall. Its seat was dust-covered. A single feather had landed on it and stayed. The floor bore lines where furniture had once been moved, dragged from one side to another, scuffing the stone, wearing it smooth. Those lines had stopped long ago, but they remained, ghost paths across the flagstones. In the corner, a scroll rack stood, its compartments mostly empty. One parchment remained, rolled tight, tied with a brittle ribbon. The knot had frozen in place, the ends frayed outward like the wings of a bird that had decided not to lift. High above, a bell still hung, not large, not ceremonial, just a bell. It had no rope, no striker, but the beam that held it remained strong. A strip of sunlight touched the bell for one brief moment, then faded. Dust floated through the shaft of light like snow that didn't know how to fall, and the hall stayed still, not waiting, not remembering, just being. The kitchen didn't smell like anything anymore. Not smoke, not herbs, not warmth, just stone and quiet. It sat low in the castle, off a narrow corridor where the ceiling dipped and the light grew dim. The room was long, wider at one end than the other, and lined with hearths that hadn't seen flame in years. One still held the frame of a spit, rusted through, the supports bent toward each other like they'd grown tired of standing apart. The floor was stone here, uneven from wear. The middle held the shallow depression of years walked in circles, from hearth to counter, from shelf to fire, back again. That rhythm had ended long ago, but the shape of it remained. Dust had settled into the grooves, dulling their depth, but not erasing them. A long table sat in the center. One leg had been propped up with a flat stone. Another leaned too far, warping the surface so nothing rested evenly. Bowls were still there, clay chipped at the rims, one turned upside down, one half filled with pebbles that had somehow found their way inside. A spoon lay beside the bowl, wood, worn smooth at the handle, stain dark at the tip, the kind of stain that never comes out, not with water, not with scrubbing. Not that anyone had tried. One cupboard door hung open at the far wall, its hinge squealing softly when the wind passed through just right. Inside, shelves sagged under the weight of nothing, save for a few jars, a scrap of cloth, a bundle of dried roots tied with twine that had long since frayed. The hearth at the far end had collapsed on one side. Sturm fallen inward, blackened with old soot, now layered with dust and time. A kettle had once hung above the embers. The hook remained. The kettle did not. On a shelf above the largest hearth, a row of spice tins still stood, each one sealed, each one marked in faded ink. No scent escaped them, no label could be read. To the left, a chopping block had cracked down the middle, a split so clean it looked deliberate. A knife lay nearby, its blade dulled, the handle rotted in places, but still whole, still shaped by use. The window was narrow and high, barred with iron that had rusted to orange-brown. It let in light without warmth. The sill had gathered leaves and dust, one feather, and the brittle shell of something that had once crawled across the stones and never left. A pitcher sat on a low shelf near the door, half a glove of water gone still and green. Something floated near the surface, a seed or a speck of bark. It hadn't moved in days, maybe longer. The surface didn't ripple. Even sound didn't reach it. Cobwebs hung in the upper corners, loose in some places, tight in others. One curled around an old hook set into the ceiling, swinging slightly in the breeze that slipped in under the door. It didn't squeak. It didn't creak. It just moved, slow and unbothered. There was no fire here now. The scent of bread, no warmth in the stone, but the kitchen hadn't collapsed, hadn't rotted through, hadn't been taken back. It had simply stopped, and everything within it had agreed to stay still. The corridor narrowed before it opened again, not into a grand chamber, but into a long room made for function. The ceiling lowered, the walls tightened. The air felt stiller here, not because it was colder, but because it had not been stirred in a long, long time. This had been a place for sleeping, resting, changing clothes, whispered conversations. The room didn't remember names. It remembered shapes. 6 cots lined each wall, 12 total, narrow, low, built from wood now faded to grey. Most still stood. One had collapsed at the middle, another leaned against the wall, its leg cracked inward and pinned with a stone block that never held quite right. The bedding was gone, but a few scraps of cloth remained, tucked in corners, hanging loose, caught under frame slats. Beneath one cot, a pair of worn shoes sat, heel to toe, leather curled, laces stiff. One was stuffed with straw. The other had a hole at the toe that looked like it had been patched once and then given up on. A shelf ran along one wall, not high, shoulder height for most, and it sagged toward the center. A cup rested there, tin or pewter, dented at the rim. Beside it, a folded cloth had become more crease than fabric. It held its shape, but not its use. Books lined the back wall. One held a coat, long, wool, faded blue with 2 missing buttons, and a stitch at the elbow done in thread too bright for the fabric. Another hook had a satchel slung from it, its leather strap cracked where it had hung in place for years without being lifted. A stool sat near the center of the room, just slightly out of place, as if someone had risen in a hurry and never moved it back. Its seat had a worn dip in the middle, smoothed from time and use. The leg, farthest from the door, wobbled if touched, but no one had touched it in a while. There was a window here, small, high, square. No glass, just open stone with a wooden shutter that hung limp on one hinge. ivy had begun to curl in from the outside. A bird had once nested in the sill, and the remnants remained. A ring of moss, 2 feathers, a strip of fabric with red embroidery no larger than a thumb. A wash basin sat on a crate in the corner, cracked along one side but not broken through. A tin cup rested inside it, turned upside down. A bar of something, once used for washing, had fused to the basin's edge, melted by time, hardened by air. On the floor beneath the farthest cot, a bundle of paper rested, folded parchment tied with string now brittle to the touch. Letters, maybe, or notes, or records no one ever came back for. The corners were curling, and one page had begun to split down the center, where it had been folded too many times. Dust had gathered in every corner, but it wasn't thick, just settled, undisturbed, the kind of dust that only forms when nothing moves enough to scatter it. Not even air. There was no draught here, no breeze, just the kind of stillness that agrees with old things. A single candle stub sat in a niche in the wall, wick untouched, wax pooled flat. A matchstick lay beside it, burned once, blackened, but not used here. The stone of the floor was smoother than in the kitchen, more worn than in the hall, softened by countless feet, bare feet likely, quiet ones, feet that stepped lightly, rose early, carried water, folded cloth, stirred coals. The walls didn't echo in here. They out, held breath, held sleep, held the shape of those who lived in rhythm. No grandeur, no ceremony, just and the memory of being needed. The door to the staircase wasn't really a door at all, just a narrow break in the stone where 2 walls met unevenly. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking, but the edge of the floor bore the faint wear of many feet stepping toward it, and the wall beside it had a smudge, a place where hands had pressed for balance again and again until the stone grew just slightly darker there. The stair spiraled downward, not tightly, not steeply, just enough to turn out of sight quickly. They were stone, wider at the outside, narrower toward the center, worn shallow in the middle, where feet had passed most often. Moss hadn't grown here, but dust had, fine, dry, caught in every crack and crevice. It didn't move. When you stepped through it, it only settled deeper. There were torch brackets along the wall, set every few steps. Some were empty, some still held stubs of wood wrapped in blackened cloth. One had a piece of wax hardened around its base, like a candle had once been jammed there in place of a torch. The wax was grey. The cloth beneath had gone brittle. Farther down, The air grew cooler, not damp, just still. The sound of your own steps stopped echoing. The space began to hold itself. Halfway down, there was a landing, just wide enough to stand and turn, not meant for anything else. A crate rested there, tipped on its side, its lid half detached. Inside, a piece of rope, a cracked oil flask, and a piece of folded linen stained in one corner. The rope had stiffened, the linen was dry. On the wall beside the landing, someone had scratched a mark, a symbol or a name, now barely legible. It had been made with something hard, not ink, possibly a knife, possibly just determination. The edges were worn, smoothed by time or by fingers passing over it. The staircase resumed its spiral, this time tighter, steeper. The last few turns grew darker, with less light reaching from above. There were no windows, no slits in the stone, only what little made it down through the broken air. Near the bottom, the stone changed colour, from grey to something deeper, not painted, just older, touched by a different kind of work. These stairs had been carved more roughly, as though added later, or as if whoever made them had cared less for beauty and more for purpose. The final step opened into a small alcove, no door, just an arch with edges softened by time. There was no inscription, no lock, no warning. Inside, the room beyond waited, low-ceilinged, quiet, a kind of space that didn't ask for attention, just care. But the staircase itself lingered. Even after you stepped off it, you could feel it behind you. Not menacing, not looming, just watching, like something that remembered its own reason for being. And in the quiet that followed, even your breath seemed to slow to match it. The room beyond the stair was colder, not with chill, but with the air here didn't move. It pressed in, quiet, weightless, unshifting. This had been an armory, not a grand one. No vaults, no engraved doors, no gilded racks, just a room with purpose, purpose that had ended. The walls still bore brackets where weapons had once hung. A few were still occupied, rusted blades, a spear with its tip bent and dulled, a shield whose leather grip had dried into a curl. One bracket held nothing but the shape of something that had hung there so long. The wall had changed colour behind it. A rack along the right wall held swords, or what was left of them. Most were sheathed in a layer of rust and dust so thick they seem carved from the same stone as the floor. One blade had fallen long ago and cracked along its centre. It lay split beneath the rack, untouched. Near the far wall, a suit of armour stood, or tried to. The legs were still upright, but the chest had caved inward at one side, and the arm had fallen, hand resting palm up beside a loose gauntlet. The helmet was still on, visor closed, dented, streaked with brown. It looked neither proud nor defeated. Just a bench sat beneath a narrow shelf. On the shelf a cloth had been left behind, once used for oiling maybe, now dry, stiff, folded loosely and forgotten. A sharpening stone rested beside it, worn into a hollow groove, and a leather strap curled into itself like a The floor here was worn in places, scuffed in others. Marks of boots, of crates dragged, of weapons dropped and retrieved again. The center of the room was clearer than the edges, the kind of open space left by movement, long since stopped. A barrel near the door still held arrows. Their fletching collapsed. Tips rusted dull. A few had snapped, their ends frayed, like they'd been struck against something harder than they expected. In the corner, a chest sat beneath a thin coat of dust. The lock had broken long ago. The lid lay open slightly. Inside, chainmail folded but crumbling at the edges. A strip of cloth, a whetstone cracked in two. One page of parchment rested inside the lid, stuck to the wood, faded nearly white. There had been writing once, orders maybe, or a name, but only the edges remained legible. Ink that had let go long ago. Cobwebs stretched across the ceiling beams, reaching down toward the weapons like vines, trying to remember what strength once looked like. No spiders moved, no sound stirred, only the steady presence of what had once been essential. The room didn't feel haunted. It felt settled, like every object inside had been told it could rest, and had taken the offer without question. No footsteps echoed here. They simply landed and stayed. The doorway was smaller here, narrow, low, as if asking you to bow slightly on your way through, not out of reverence, just awareness. Beyond it, the ceiling opened again, not like the great hall, wide and echoing, but upward, steeply vaulted, ribbed with stone arches that met at a high central point. Each rib was etched with marks, not words, not symbols, just small carvings, dots, lines, circles, some filled with pigment that had faded to powder, star maps maybe, or something that resembled them. The light in the room came from above, a round oculus in the center of the ceiling, cut directly through the stone. Glass had once covered it. Now it was open, framed with moss at the rim, vines brushing the edges. The sky above had moved into it fully, blue in the day, silver at night, unbothered by walls. Below the oculus stood a stone table, not tall, not ornate, a circle, flat, wide, smoothed by hands that had stood at its edge again and again, not to eat, not to speak, and to see. The table bore shallow carvings, a sun, a moon, a spiral, the seasons, in glyphs no longer translated around the edges, names that had not been spoken aloud in generations, some still readable, some rubbed away by fingers or rain. Mortals had once lived here, some still did, crumpled at the far corners of the room, curled into themselves. A few lay flat, pinned by stones, the ink on them scattered like wind-blown dust. One showed the sketch of a constellation, a crooked W, a long curve beneath it. Another bore only circles, no context, no notes, just circles. Shelves lined the back wall. Most were empty. A few held broken instruments, a brass device with arms that no longer turned, a piece of glass with etched lines across it, a wooden stick with notches too precisely cut to be accidental. No labels, no instruction. The floor was clean in a way that suggested not sweeping, but emptiness. A rug had once lain at the center. Its imprint remained in dust. A soft border, the outline of corners, the faint texture of weave pressed into the stone. But the rug itself was gone, lifted, removed, or disintegrated. Without sound, near the wall, a small writing desk rested, one leg shorter than the others. A stone had been wedged beneath it. One parchment lay across its surface, held by a weight. A round stone, smoothed and carved with a spiral. The parchment was blank, or faded, or maybe it had never held anything at all. A wind touched the space occasionally, just enough to stir the dust. It entered through the oculus and left the same way, trailing across the table, across the shelves, across your skin. Nothing dropped, a visitation. The air smelled of stone and old ink. of paper and time. No incense, no fire, just the breath of a place that had been allowed to stop trying to explain itself. Above, a single leaf drifted across the opening. It did not fall. It did not lapse. It passed. And in that moment, the room felt larger than it had any right to be. This room had no title, no sign above the door, no symbol carved into the stone, just a narrow arch, and the sense that you were meant to slow down before you crossed into it. The ceiling was low here, not oppressively, just enough to notice. The walls curved inward in a gentle round, like the inside of a bell or a bowl. There were no shelves, no weapons, no beds or benches. At the center, a shallow depression in the floor held the outline of something soft that had once lain there. A cushion, perhaps, or a mat? Nothing remained of it now but its absence. The shape was oval, the center worn smooth. Light came from a slit in the stone near the ceiling, a narrow vertical cut, no wider than a hand. Through it, sunlight reached in like a fingertip. The beam moved throughout the day, touching one wall in the morning, the center in midday, and the opposite side at dusk. At night, starlight entered, or moonlight, or nothing at all. The floor bore faint marks of bare feet, too soft to measure, just enough to know someone had walked slowly here, often deliberately. In the far corner, a wooden box sat against the curve of the wall. The lid was half open. Inside, a folded cloth, faded to ivory, a piece of twine tied into a loop, and a page torn from a book, the words unreadable now, except for one. Near the wall, a candle holder rested, iron, shaped like a spiral, its base wide for balance. The candle was long since burned down, but a bit of wax had melted into the spiral's grooves, catching light when you moved. A match rested in the holder's curve, burned, still whole. The air here felt different, heavier, maybe, or lighter. Hard to say, not a space made for watching, not for gathering, just for being. A small crack in the wall near the floor let in the faintest breath of wind. Not cold, just present. It made a soft, steady sound, almost like breath. Not timed, and not patterned, just there. The chamber didn't ask questions. It didn't offer answers. But if you sat, the stone would remember the shape of you and not ask why you come. There were no tools left here, no evidence of learning, no symbols to translate, and still you understood everything, because sometimes quiet explains more than anything ever written. And this room had never needed language to hold what it held. The stairs that followed were narrow, cut into the stone between walls that no longer fully stood. One side had long since fallen away, leaving only air and a few broken battlements. The steps remained, thin, curved, uneven, winding slowly upward around the remains of a turret. Here the wind had more room. It didn't rush, but it moved, constant, deliberate, shaped by stone and sky. It carried the scent of moss and dry dust. It carried birdsong, distant. It carried nothing urgent. The higher you climbed, the more the castle revealed itself, below and beyond. The courtyard was just a patch now, the fountain a pale ring, the banners inside hidden again behind stone and shadow. Only the tops of trees rose to meet this level, green and swaying. Their tips moved in long arcs, brushing air that had forgotten what it was like to stop. Small things rested in the cracks of the tower wall, a twig that had lodged there long ago, a feather, white and curved at the tip, a flat stone smoothed by wind until it resembled a coin. None of it placed, just kept. The sliver of cloth hung from a corner of stone. Deep blue once, now sun-bleached to sky grey. It twisted gently, caught in a draught that returned every few minutes like a tide without water. It didn't flap, just turned, slowly. Near the top, where the stairs ended, a flat platform open to sky. No roof, just the remains of a parapet and the memory of purpose. There had once been a bell here. The support beam still bore the rusted bolts that had held it. The bell itself was gone. A streak of green on the stone floor showed where it might have fallen, or been taken, or never existed at all. A pole leaned into the corner. Iron, bent slightly at the top. Once it had held a flag or a light. Now it held only rust and lichen. The wind was stronger here. Not loud, just insistent. It moved across the stone, lifted the edge of your coat, touched the back of your neck. It didn't ask permission. Far below, the forest stretched out in all directions, a living sea of branches and leaves, soft at the top, dark beneath. Those clouds moved slowly overhead, not gathered, just passing. A single bird wheeled through them, then was gone. Its call didn't reach this high, only its shape. Somewhere behind the trees, the sun was beginning to shift, not setting, but turning. The light had changed, more gold than white now, more sideways than above. A crack in the stone underfoot had filled with soil at some point. From it, a flower had grown, small, white, no taller than a thumb. It bent in the breeze, but held. The platform didn't shake, didn't creak, didn't resist. It simply held space, the air, the wind, for whatever wanted to leave or linger or look down. This wasn't a place for decision. It was a place for breath. The doors were gone. Only two rusted hinges remained on either side of the stone threshold, streaked with orange where rain had passed again and again. The entry arch was tall and plain, with no inscription, no decoration, just curved stone softened at the edges and crowned now by a slow-growing braid of ivy. There was no roof, not a collapsed one, not shattered beams, just open air and the faint outline where the ceiling must have once met the walls. Now sunlight came in freely, and so did wind, so did birds. The floor was laid in wide, flat stone. It had once held pews. You could see the shadows of them, dark rectangles where the wood had sat for years. The wood itself was long gone. Only one plank remained, set against the far wall, warped and split down its middle. A single nail stuck out, bent sideways, holding nothing. Grass had begun to grow in patches between the stones. Not thick, not wild, just small tufts in quiet corners, and a green haze that clung to cracks and edges where light and rain had gathered long enough for life to return. At the front of the chapel stood the altar. It was low and square, made of the same stone as the rest of the room, but smoother, worn down at the top as if it had been touched again and again by careful hands. There was no decoration on it now, only dust. A few dry leaves had collected near the center, gathered by wind. One of them lay flat, as if it had been placed there on purpose. You could tell a cloth had once covered the altar. Small threads still clung to the sides. Nothing intact, only hints of pattern and color, now faded into beige and grey. The fabric had frayed slowly over time and been taken away by weather, peace. Behind the altar, A tall window faced the forest. It had once been filled with stained glass, and some of it still remained. A few fragments of colour clung to the frame, deep red, a dull gold, a sliver of green. They were caught in the stone like teeth that hadn't let go. Light came through them still. It painted faint shapes on the wall. Not whole stories, just colour, just memory. A small alcove to the left held an iron basin. It was rusted through at the edges, but still attached to the wall. The bowl inside it was dry, but something about the shape of it made you want to reach your hand in. Not because of ritual, but because it seemed like something someone had done for a long time. The wind passed through the chapel gently. It didn't whistle or cry. It moved in slow, soft turns, brushing across the floor, lifting a loose thread, setting it down again. Once in a while, it stirred a leaf or pressed against the frame where a bell had once hung. In the highest corner, tucked where a beam used to be, a nest had been built. Bits of thread and dry grass were woven together with care. A strip of blue cloth was looped through the side, and something pale and flat was tucked deep inside. Maybe a paper scrap, maybe a feather. Near the back wall, a low bench sat uneven on the stone. One leg had broken and been braced with a rock. On the bench's surface, a small copper dish rested. Melted wax pooled at the centre. The candle it once held had burned completely down, and the wick had curled into itself. No one came here now. No voice echoed, no sermon waited, but the room hadn't forgotten how to feel open or kind. The walls were bare. There were no scriptures, no carved emblems, no names left behind. Only stone, only sky. A butterfly passed through the oculus where the roof used to be. It floated over the altar and through the coloured light. It didn't land. It didn't stop. It passed through the empty window and disappeared, and the chapel didn't ask it to stay. This was once a hall of pride, a procession where colours were worn on high ceilings and names were spoken with purpose. Now light entered quietly through long, narrow windows. Most had no glass, just open space and the wind that moved through without asking. A few still held slivers of stained panes, more grime than colour now. But when the sun hit them just right, they still painted soft pools of red, blue, and green across the floor. The banners still hung, not all of them, and not completely, along the upper walls, where rods once held perfect folds of velvet or linen. A few lengths of fabric remained, torn, faded, curled at the corners like parchment left out in the weather. One had once been deep purple, another forest green, a third hung in shreds, only the top portion intact, its symbol long since worn away. The gold thread that had once lined their edges was tarnished to dull grey. Where crests had been embroidered, now only faint outlines remained, stitched shadows of forgotten houses, faded shapes that could have been crowns or wings or fire, but nothing certain. The walls beneath the banners were cool to the touch, the stone veined in pale lines where moisture had once crept in and dried again. Moss had begun to grow near the floor, soft and low, like the start of a rug that didn't know where it was going. It didn't creep far, it just settled. A shield hung on the back wall. Its surface was dented and dull, a crack splitting one edge. No sword accompanied it. The leather straps that once held it secure had loosened and stretched with time. The shield leaned forward now, not enough to fall, just enough to seem tired. In the corners of the room sat crates and chests that had been untouched for decades. One was open, its lid slumped against the wall. Inside were scraps of cloth folded between parchment sheets, perhaps for ceremony or storage. A single torch still rested in a wall bracket, though it hadn't been lit in generations. Its head was blackened. The bracket beneath it had rusted into the wall, leaving a rust shadow that had dripped like paint down the stone. Beneath one window, a small wooden table sat unevenly. The legs were mismatched. One had been replaced with a stack of stones. A silver dish sat at the center of the tabletop, empty now, but polished on one side, as if fingers had touched it there often. Not recent, but often. The floor showed lines where furniture had once been dragged. Wide benches or long tables that had scraped the stone over and over. Those lines remained even after the furniture had gone. Memory carved into surface. Purpose worn down to texture. In the dust, a piece of ribbon had settled, thin, blue-grey, torn at both ends. One edge still curled upward, like it had caught the breeze just before landing. It lay beside a small metal pin, bent out of shape, the kind once fastened to a collar or a sash. The wind moved through slowly, no urgency. It tugged at the bottom edge of a banner and passed through the frame of the empty window, brushing light across the floor like a painter unsure of their next stroke. The colors on the floor moved as the sun moved, sometimes full, sometimes faint, sometimes not there at all. But even when the light failed, the banners stayed, and the stone did not forget what they used to mean. Even if the castle no longer spoke their names. It's easy to think of a castle as a building, walls, rooms, stones stacked in purpose. But by now, it's clear it isn't just that. It's a shape, a body, a quiet creature that doesn't move, but still changes. Not alive in the way we know, but not forgotten either, not by itself. The castle holds things, not in vaults or books or plaques, but in air, in dust, in the way light lands at the same angle on the same step every morning. Whether anyone sees it or not, there are places in the castle where people once laughed, not loudly, not in celebration, just soft laughter, the kind that lives in corners and behind doors, shed during work or passing. That laughter doesn't echo anymore, but the air still knows its shape. There are stones that were carried by hand, up hills, across rivers, through seasons of rain and frost, stones with thumbprints on them, pressed in while the mortar was still wet, not marked on purpose, just present. And just on it, there are nails driven in by someone who once sang under their breath. There are hinges hung by hands that once trembled. There are stairs where someone stopped halfway, not because they were tired, just because they were thinking. And the castle remembers all of it. And that, like a mind, like a body, remembers the places it's been touched. The courtyard held footsteps once, 100, maybe more. Now it holds weeds and weather and the mark of time. But somewhere beneath the moss, the flagstones remember where people used to stand while waiting for someone else to speak, and what it meant to wait without knowing what came next. The towers knew watchfulness. They felt weight. They bore the pressure of eyes, searching the horizon for answers. They don't carry that weight anymore, but they still face outward. The walls that line the great halls once knew firelight, not for warmth, but for glow, for gathering, for marking time, not in hours, but in conversation and glances. and the sound of someone refilling a cup. Now, those flames are long gone, but the soot still clings faintly in high corners, and the shadows stretch themselves out as if waiting for the light to come back, not asking, just available. There were arguments here. There were silences that meant more than words. There were decisions that changed things, and choices that didn't, and the walls didn't judge. They just held all of it. The cracks between stones weren't made by war. They were made by time, by ice, by root, by the soft insistence of seasons that don't care about walls. And the castle let them in. It didn't fight. It didn't surrender. It simply opened slowly to what was real. There is no one here now. Not really, but that doesn't mean the castle is empty. Carriage is still full of absence, of echo, of soft space, of the kind of quiet that comes only after everything has been spoken. And nothing needs to be said again. It doesn't guard secrets anymore, and it doesn't offer sanctuary. It doesn't ask to be found, but it is here, and what it held, it still holds. There is no final door, no archway to step through, no clear line where the castle ends and the world begins again. It just opens, without instruction, without resistance. Stone begins to give way to air. The walls don't collapse, they just stop continuing. The outer path curves outward into a wide slope, and the land stretches gently towards sky. What was structure begins suggestion, and then even that begins to fade. From above, the castle is a shape, part square, part circle, part puzzle with missing pieces. Roofless rooms, moss-covered stones, a dry fountain that still holds its center. What banners remain flutter slightly, barely lifting from the walls. The wind doesn't rush them, it moves around them, brushing fabric, like fingertips brushing pages already turned. Sunlight finds everything now. It rests on the stairwells, moves across the stones where people once stood. It slides through windows that have lost their glass and paints gold on flagstones that haven't been walked in years. Some of the old stained glass fragments still catch the light and cast small colours, a patch of red on a broken arch, a line of blue across the grass, a circle of gold near where a fire pit used to be. Nothing shines, but everything glows. The wind continues. not as a force, but as a presence. It loops through the towers, through what's left of them. It passes over the courtyard, along the broken walls, and up into the spaces where ceilings used to stretch. It stirs dust without lifting its shape. The air has memory here, but not urgency. And up, high, in the shell of what was once the tallest tower, a bird lands. It does not call out. It does not search for anything. It stays for a moment, still, then leaves. Its wings move like thought, unannounced, quiet, inevitable. It disappears into sky, and the sky doesn't notice. Or maybe it does, but says nothing. The walls don't echo anymore. They don't try. Their voices have grown soft, not mute, just finished. There are cracks where water once ran down in heavy rain, now dry. There are beams where moss has grown like lace along the edges. There are stairs that no longer lead anywhere in particular, and yet still welcome each step. And above it all, the sky opens wider. It presses in, not with weight, but with space. It leans down through empty towers and roofless halls. It touches the tops of stones where names used to be carved. It fills the spaces once held by banners and bells and breath. It doesn't rush to claim what's been left behind. It simply receives it. In the corner of the great hall, a strip of spider silk catches the light. It moves slightly, curls inward, then disappears when the breeze shifts. One petal from a flower outside has drifted in through the frame of a missing window. It spins slowly in the air and lands without sound. Somewhere far off, the sea makes its noise. Not close enough to be clear, but present enough to know it still exists. It folds and unfolds itself again and again, like fabric being smoothed for someone no longer arriving. There are no voices here, no footsteps, no echoing doors or crackling fire. And still, it is not empty. It is full of what was, full of things that stayed because they were never asked to leave. The stone no longer holds weight. It holds memory. The windows no longer frame views. They let the sky pass through. The wind no longer cools. It brushes. It listens. It remains. Everything that once mattered is still here. It's just softer now. The moss has moved in where ceremony used to be. The light has found the pages that were never read. The air has settled into shapes that used to be movement. And the silence isn't lonely. It's deliberate. Above all, the sky is still, wide, pale, full. Not blue, not grey, just open. And the castle quietly, slowly releases itself, not into ruin, not into story, just into being. The wind moves on, the stone cools, and everything that once stood with purpose now simply rests.